you've made it through another day. I'm making assumptions that we includes all of us. I mean, after all, if you're here and you're watching me, that we is inclusive of you, particularly if you're watching me live. Happy Friday evening. Hope everyone has had a pretty decent day, and for that matter, had a pretty decent week. Tulsi Gabbard. I want to talk about Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard did a Morning Joe interview where she is dealing with a cast of people who is not liking what Tulsi Gabbard has to say. And she's facing off with what amounts to smear merchants on Morning Joe. And it's the oddest thing in the world that you're getting smeared because you're anti-war, which is, for all intents and purposes, what is taking place. I'm going to show these before I get to it. Guys, if you enjoy the content and you enjoy what's being put out, and you find yourself coming back here often, I have a lot of people who say they didn't start off, but they find themselves making this show a part of their day. I always appreciate when people say that. If that's true, please consider liking or sharing, liking the video, sharing it, subscribing, if you're not a member at this point, or if you definitely find yourself coming here often, please consider supporting through PayPal or Patreon. Let's get to the content. All right, so let's take a look at this. I find it's just an odd thing to watch. There are two video clips that I want to show on this. And it is the most bizarre thing in the world to me. Now, Tulsi Gabbard has said she's an anti-war. She's taken a strident anti-war stance. I did the campaign speech when she first announced her presidency. She has been strident. She has been unapologetic on this particular front, and she has pushed this perspective. Being anti-war is not just kind of an ephemeral thing. I mean, there are consequences to saying you're anti-war, which means that there's policy that goes along with the idea of being anti-war, and those policies have certain actions around the globe. There's certain consequences, not just, have a policy and there's a disconnected from the world itself. In her case, being anti-war puts her at odds with the media establishment that, for the most part, is pro-war and is unapologetic in being pro-war, which puts her, to some degree, in a position of having to defend her stances of being pro-war. By the way, her stances are just rational and legal. What they're arguing about are things that are not all that legal, but they don't even have any issue with that position, if that makes sense. I'm going to show you what I mean, because they let the cat out of the bag when they're talking about this meeting. They know what they are being squirrely with in regards to their audience, and not necessarily giving them the full story of this, particularly not the full context, which is the point that Tulsi Gabbard is making when she's making this argument of our foreign policy is not being beneficial to Americans. I understand there's a pro-war establishment of things, but from the standpoint of the American citizenry, what is in the best interest of the American public in making a more safe and just world? Our foreign policy is not achieving those objectives. Let's take a listen to her defend herself. She holds her ground. No complaints. She holds her ground, and she consistently makes the point over and over again. But they smear her so like, they call her a Putin puppet. They say Putin is helping you out. They call her an Assad apologist. All this stuff. She's done none of this. There is a difference between me looking at what is in the best interest of the American public and coming up with policy within the framework of our laws that stops us from this setting fires in various places around the globe. That's sane. That's utterly rational, especially when you're talking about what's in the interest of the American public. Let's take a look at this. We can talk about it as we go through it. The first one I'm going to show is them just smearing her and her pushing back on this with this kind of, I think it was an NBC News article that said that Vladimir Putin was helping her out. And essentially the organization that they based that article on was the exact same organization that created puppet accounts, Russian puppet accounts, to try to blame, to say that Doug Jones' opponent, Republican opponent, was getting help from Russians. That organization that created those puppet accounts is the same organization that came out saying Tulsi Gabbard was being assisted by the Russians. They were stirring at it. Let's take a look at her pushback on this. She does a good job, at least I think she does.
There have been reports that that Russian apparatus that interfered in 2016 is potentially trying to help your campaign. Why do you think that
Cite those reports and their credibility.
Well, the Russian propaganda machine, we did an analysis actually.
I just want to
NBC
point out.
News.
I want to point out that that NBC article has been debunked and disproven.
By whom?
Because I would ask you to look at the credibility of the sources and the so-called experts.
Well, I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that my colleagues did not do their due diligence.
Other journalists
I do know what our standards are here.
Other journalists have debunked and disproven the so-called experts that have been cited in that article. And I think it's actually very dangerous for articles like that and outlets like NBC to put out this information that seeks to bully people into saying, you can't come out and take the positions that I've taken of calling for an end to the Cold War, calling for an end to this nuclear crisis that we are facing. Otherwise, you're going to be smeared as someone who is a subject of Russian propaganda.
And she's right, by the way. Like, if I take a position of anti-war and say, look, we need to get out of these wars. Donald Trump is pulling out of these treaties. He's putting weapons in space. The Democrats, for the most part, are on board with this kind of muscular military policy with regards to Russia, because in their minds, Russia hacked the election and got Donald Trump elected, as opposed to Hillary Clinton just outright losing. And we are at a dangerous precipice. Now, Tulsi Gabbard's point is we need to come from the precipice. That ultimately we need to stop this hawkish foreign policy. Where we are instigating ourselves around the globe, where we're circling Russia. We need to have conversation. We need to be able to talk. And yeah, we also need to have treaties on the stuff that Donald Trump is ripping up. I guess my point is you need to have a certain degree of collaboration with these countries, and we've been demonizing Russia relentlessly over a failure of a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. Taking a position of anti-war, I would imagine that if you were Russia, you would probably want the United States to not be anti-war. By the same token, if you are an American and you're paying nearly $1 trillion for a military budget, you may also want us to not be anti-war. Like, I guess my point is the very fact that Vladimir Putin or the Russian government may prefer a position of the United States being against war and creating all of these fires across the globe. So what? Like, I'm looking at this from the standpoint of the interests of the people in the United States and the interests of me, who doesn't necessarily want all of our money going to these wars. I mean, for fuck's sake, we're spending nearly $1 trillion. And do you realize we can cut the military budget in half and it will still be twice as much as the next country? And we're talking about the majority of the countries on that list of the top 10 are our allies. We're spending an ungodly amount of money. And when you talk about healthcare and education and, green energy, can't afford those things. But yes, we can afford to spend this much money on a military budget that's overtly bloated. What Tulsi Gabbard is saying here is right. We stumbled through this kind of nuclear, this Cold War, but we stumbled through it. We got through that just on dumb luck. And that's with people with the, political facilities of John F. Kennedy. And I guess you can say Khrushchev at a certain point got freaked out by the entire process because he thought they were going to end the world. But you get my point. And right now we have Trump. That's the guy that's in office, with John Bolton whispering in his ear, with the Democratic Party that is on board for a more hawkish foreign policy with regards to Russia, essentially the pro-war party. That's what you're talking about. What she's saying is right. It has nothing to do with Putin. It has everything to do with what do you want your country to do and how much resources, so how much of your worth do you want to spend on these particular things? And do you believe that it's making your world a better place? I guess my point is the answer is no, you're not. And both sides have started developing a new arms race. You need to back away from that. And the path that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are taking you is not backing away from it. There was the hope that when Donald Trump got in office that he would somehow back away from it, but he was been attacked so relentlessly that's been somewhat of an impossibility to do. At this point, what Tulsi Gabbard is saying is right. We need to back away. The fact that Putin may try to back her up. It's not necessarily like you automatically reflexively do the opposite of what Vladimir Putin does. It's utter nonsense. It is very possible that you can have somebody that's an adversary and you just so happen to agree on a particular point. This particular point is we're spending far too much of our worth on war. There are areas of the country that doesn't even have clean water. We're talking about Green New Deal. That would include high-speed rail. That would include, bringing down the amount of car use that people use. All sorts of things. How do you pay for it? Which is the question. While simultaneously running a foreign policy where you're spending $719 billion on issues of war. Cut that budget in half, turn those things into jobs internal to the country. And several billions of that go into... There's an artist, Cannabis, who had this line that drop food and clothing instead of dropping bombs. That's where I'm at. I agree with him. You get more bang for your buck. There's one more clip on this. Well, actually, there may be more to this one. Let me check.
So you're essentially saying that you do not think that Russians are helping you at all, and that in fact any reporting to that effect is bullying Americans into not supporting
What I'm saying is the article that was put out has proven...
So Russians aren't helping you at all. Are you saying that the Russians aren't backing you in this campaign? How gross is this? How gross is this? It feels racist to some degree. I mean, in the way that they're going at the Russians. This kind of derogatory way in which the Russians, it's not even communism anymore. But they're acting as if her campaign is somehow being paid for by the Russians. That's fucking amazing. There's one more clip that I want to show with this. They're talking about Syria. Let's listen to this clip. This clip is amazing. Listen to how they describe... Well, let us talk about it first. Because some of the stuff they're saying here is grossly illegal, or at the very least, to some degree unethical, at least from a legal sense. Or let's say legally questionable at best. But let's hear him out.
Do you think Assad is our enemy?
Assad is not the enemy of the United States because Syria does not pose a direct threat to the United States.
What do you say to Democratic voters who watched you go over there, and what do you say to military members who have been deployed repeatedly in Syria, pushing back against Assad?
People who have been deployed to Syria have been there focused on their mission, which has been to defeat ISIS.
Yes, 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 yes. Oh, talking about showing your hand, So what do you say to the people over there who are there against Assad? We're not in Syria for Assad. We're not in Syria for Assad. Assad has never attacked us. No one has even ever made that argument that we were in Syria for Assad. It is understood that we were, meaning in an intellectual way, that we were there to some degree to try to get rid of Assad. That reporter knows exactly why we were in Syria, meaning to get rid of Assad. It was somewhat of a coup. The United States has been funding both sides of this. Now, under the best light, and I don't take this light at all, I take a more cynical point of view of this. Under the best light, Saudis were given over weapons, and so were the United States giving weapons to these guys, or at the very least they were falling into the hands of terrorists. I would even go further and say they were supporting the terrorists in that country in order to try to undermine and get rid of Assad, while simultaneously putting forces in for ISIS. Both were taking place. The CIA was arming terrorists in that region of the globe. It might have started off as this kind of conflict from a standpoint of public uprising of sorts against Assad. But very soon after that, the various countries, meaning Western countries, the United States, France, Britain, were assisting the terrorists in that region of the globe. There were reports that were coming out saying that the capabilities of ISIS far exceeds what they would typically have. Meaning the weapons that they were getting their hands onto, the weapons they were getting their hands onto was American made. CNN has just done a story showing that the weapons that were being handed over, in some cases, to the terrorists in that region of the globe. But you don't have to look at CNN in this case. New York Times did the story talking about the CIA arming essentially terrorists in that region of the globe to take down Assad. Like, what she's saying, the reporter, is right, but that's not the legal reasoning that was being used to back this up. We're there to fight ISIS. Great. But you weren't there to fight ISIS. We were there to do both. But ISIS was used as a battering ram to try to knock out Assad. It was going to be a coup. It even went so far as we were protecting terrorists in Idlib. I think they were saying like UN says tens of thousands of terrorists were in Idlib. And Trump got to the point of threatening this kind of larger conflict if Russia attacked them in order to get rid of the terrorists in that region. Like, let's let her finish. Let's let her play out because I want her to make her case. But I'm just saying this is an amazing pattern of attack. You go to a country to figure out what's actually happening in the country because you don't believe the reporting. And the very act of doing that gets you set as a Putin or as an Assad apologist. And arguing that Assad is not attacking us, which is somewhat flat fact true. And that Assad is not our enemy, again, which is flat fact true. We're in his country, not the other way around. That's the most rational thing in the world. And to them, that is a bizarre concept. Because if we want to go into a country, we should be able to go into a country. I find this to be an amazing bit of logic here. But our job in this was not to take down Assad. Supposedly, we were there for ISIS. The reality is what this reporter knows, that we were there to take down Assad.
Our troops have not gone to Syria to wage yet another costly, pose a direct threat to the United States.
What do you say to Democratic voters who watched you go over there, and what do you say to military members who have been deployed repeatedly in Syria, pushing back against Assad?
People who have been deployed to Syria have been there focused on their mission, which has been to defeat ISIS. Our troops have not gone to Syria to wage yet another costly, destructive regime change war. And many troops I hear from express frustration at the fact that our country continues to wage senseless, costly regime change wars, followed by nation-building missions, leading to situations like we see in Afghanistan. So many examples of our troops being deployed, their lives put on the line, without understanding what the clear mission or objective is and how that mission actually serves the security of the American people in the United States.
Which I think...
Yes. Uber rational. Uber rational. A person sitting on the moon, looking at events, and that answer... Look, if you're a troop... If you're a soldier in the combat zone, it's one thing for you to sign up in order to fight in a war because it betters the interests of your country. Meaning, not politicians. I'm talking about your country, the individuals and the people that are within your country. Your country is under threat. You're out there in order to prevent those threats from hitting back home. But that's not what's happening. And her point in this is a troop, a soldier, who wants to be in this position of doing the best thing in protection of the country is wondering, why am I here? They're not attacking us. They're not trying to attack us. We've been attacking them. So why am I here? We're in somebody else's country illegally. They don't want us here. Russians and Iran have been invited into somebody else's country. That person is the sovereign government of that particular country. Why are we here? That's her point. That's an uber rational point. What fig leaf of law is being used to take down Assad? Which, again, was not the stated mission, even though that's what they keep talking about because they know the truth. Let's let it keep going.
A lot of Americans would agree with you there, but again, going back to Assad, Assad is not an enemy. Is he an adversary of the United States?
We have to look to who poses a threat to the United States and the American people.
I understand that, but there are a lot of people who don't pose a direct military threat to the United States who consider themselves to be adversaries of the United States. Vladimir Putin poses or considers America to be an enemy. We consider Russia to be an adversary. I'm just asking you, do you consider Assad to be an adversary of the United States?
When I look at whether it's Syria or Turkey or Russia or China or other countries in the world, I look at what are their interests and are their interests counter to our interests.
So what would you say he is to the United States? If you can...
Again, that's uber rational and maybe too cerebral. I mean, I hear that answer, and the answer makes all the sense in the world to me. It's like, I don't necessarily need to define them as anything. What are their interests, and are their interests counter to our own, and other areas in which we can find a certain commonality? Uber rational. And they look at this as like, yeah, but you need to name that. What do I need to name it as? I just named it. I just told you exactly what it was. The bare bones of the philosophy that I'm using to look at the world is, what are their interests? Are their interests counter to our own? And if they are, what are areas where we can make amends? I guess my point is, and her point is, our foreign policy now, like doing this thing of labeling somebody an adversary or an enemy, it's like, well, what are they trying to get at? I think in her mind, she thinks that they're trying to get her with a got you of sorts. In some degree, she's taking an anti-war platform, so she may be somewhat hesitant, and you could say fracturing, breaking her shape on this. I don't necessarily think it's a breaking of shape to say a country may be an adversary. Again, the words are slippery. It depends on what you mean by adversary. It's easy to explain away this idea of adversary using her own definition of the term adversary. But she doesn't want to break shape. So great for her for holding her ground. I love it. And I love the fact that she's explaining it. Like it's not this short snapshot. It's somebody finally defending the position of anti-war and doing so in an absolutely rational way. And it's so rational that Joe had to say, yeah, that's true. That's what most Americans would think. Then her position is her position is a mainstream position. And even though in the circles to which these guys function, it is not. It's such a bizarre thing that anti-war is somehow the negative.
Cannot say that he's an adversary or an enemy. What is Assad to the U.S.? What is the word?
You can describe it however you want to describe it.
I want to know how you describe it.
My point is that whether it is Syria or any of these other countries, we need to look at how their interests are counter to or aligned with ours.
Are Assad's interests aligned with ours?
What are Assad's interests?
Assad seems interested in the slaughter primarily of his own people, in part. I mean, how does that line up? Survival, yes.
Exactly.
Well, he also
and he seems to be willing to go to great ends to do that.
He also uses weapons of mass destruction on his
adversary
as well.
I
mean, we can talk about all these things. My point here is,
just as somewhat of a flat fact, just because a bad guy exists doesn't necessarily mean it's your job to take that bad guy out. It's not your responsibility. Meaning, there's nothing under law that says the United States government is going to go into another nation and take out the sovereign person of a particular country because they don't like the guy. He's a bad guy, so we reserve the right to take that bad guy out. We have plenty of bad guys, people who are somewhat authoritarian that we're perfectly okay with. We've put dictators in all over the world, particularly when those dictators suited our interests. Either they are blissfully unaware of this, or these are not necessarily things that they want to talk about and they're looking from a very particular perspective. I'm saying the perspective that they're looking for is magnificently jaded. Tulsi is right here. Whatever Assad's interests are, Assad's interest is remaining in power. Our interest has been to try to take Assad out of power. It is not our responsibility. We have no legal edifice at all that makes this okay, which is why they were using a fig leaf of ISIS. They've removed the pretense of ISIS at this point. They've just gone to this idea of Assad. It's not our responsibility to take Assad out of office. It is not our responsibility to invade somebody else's country and remove those people and spend American treasure to do so. It is the people of Syria are responsible for the people of Syria. Let's keep going. We're almost done.
Is it important to talk about these things? That he uses chemical weapons on his own people?
Of course, of course. It's important to talk about how our military is being used, what it is costing them, what it is costing the American people, and whether or not those missions, those objectives serve the security of the United States and the American people.
So do you think, Congresswoman, there should be any United States troops stationed in Syria?
I don't believe there should be.
None at all.
But
what are you using to keep those troops there? What are you using? Like, what is the rationale? You're in somebody else's country. Understand what I'm saying here. You are literally in someone else's country. You're not there because they want you to be there. You are instigating yourself into somebody else's country based on your own highfalutin idea of self. We're a protector of the world. We're a policeman of the world, so we can do whatever we want, including invade somebody else's territory. I'm asking, what legal fig leaf are you using to make this work. You're not there because somebody invited you there. You're there through an act of force. What Tulsi Gabbard is saying here again is correct. The responsibility of Syria is to the people of Syria. It is not for the United States to have our troops in these countries in this way. We are causing chaos. If people are causing chaos. Let's go back to her.
Again, this goes back to how are we making these decisions? The many leaders in Congress and even leaders in the administration are saying we should keep troops in Syria to counter Iran. There has been no war declared by Congress against Iran. There's no authorization legally for the United States to maintain troops in Syria. So whether it is in Syria or in other parts of the world, we have to determine, are these missions worthy of our service members' sacrifice? And do those missions serve the interests of the American people?
You've expressed skepticism in the past that used at all in Syria?
Syrian regime, but by other bad actors and terrorists within Syria.
You know, there are people who will watch this and have heard your previous comments and wonder what's going on here. Why you met with Assad?
I'm interested in the truth.
Why it looks like you were very cozy with Assad, and why you've sort of taken his side in this argument.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Taking the sides? God, this guy's a goddamn goofball. Taking the position that it is not for the United States to topple another government. It's not taking the guy's side. It's taking the position that it's not for the United States to do it. There's a difference in those things. I mean, hey, maybe if you're not that intellectually bright, you can't necessarily see the difference in those things. Maybe if you're a political hack and you just want to smear the other person, maybe you intentionally miss the difference in those things. But there is a drastic difference in those things. Me not wanting our country to go and use our boot and our treasure and our blood to go and destroy another country that's going to cause chaos, just like it did in Libya, just massive amounts of chaos, massive amounts of deaths. Me not wanting that to take place, somehow taking the side of the guy who's in charge of the country. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. This is an aggravating interview to watch, because what she's saying is uber rational. And it's rational from the perspective of, look, we've been instigating ourselves in one country after the next. We've been setting fire all over the world. We've been toppling governments left and right that we didn't particularly like. Democratic governments in some cases, and putting in dictators. We are taking ourselves to the precipice of a nuclear showdown, or at the very least a showdown with Russia and China, and maybe some other countries that may get in on this. This is problematic, and it's not serving the interests of the American public. And from this perspective of the soldier who decides to, sign a particular commission that brings him into the military and gives himself, particularly even his life, for some pursuit, you would hope that those pursuits are good pursuits, are within the legal framework of this particular country. And often, many of these pursuits are not. That should change. And if I'm president, I'm going to change it. That's over-rational as a position to take, particularly if you're talking about anti-war. And their take on this, journalistic take, quote-unquote journalistic, is Putin puppet, Assad apologist, or toady, as the other woman was saying. Talk about dim bulbs. And these are the people that they watch, like every morning. People get up and set their day to these dimwits. It's aggravating to hear this, like to watch this. All right, I have one more video that I want to do before it gets too late. But Tulsi was great on this. I mean, she held her ground, she went back down, and despite all of them being somewhat skeptical of what she was saying, even though what she was saying was, again, uber rational, she held her shape. I love this. Love this, I love this, I love this. Andy Quinn. So if the CIA are funding those opposed to Assad and the Pentagon are funding those opposed to ISIS, is the U.S. with CIA now? Well, there were reports that came out where factions that were associated with the CIA and factions associated with the United States military were fighting one another at certain points. Because, again, we were funding both. I mean, the goal of it was to take down Assad, but this also kind of weird thing of also trying to take down ISIS. It's such a bizarre thing. But all things being equal, we were funding terrorists in that region of the globe in order to sever, to shatter Syria. It just so happened that the Russian government backed them up to prevent that country from being collapsing. And they attack her for pointing out that maybe we shouldn't be involved of regime change. And they're like, oh God, that's mind-blowing. It's like, that's mind-blowing. That's a mind-blowing concept. It's not a mind-blowing concept. All right, this video is going long, so I'm going to end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.